Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Julie Petty, and I work with Meat and Livestock Australia as the Goat Industry Project Manager. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today and taking the time to learn a bit more about the MLA Cost of Production Calculator. Today's webinar is a follow-up to the one we held last week, and don't worry if you missed it. We recorded it, and it is available on the MLA website. So last week's webinar was all around just some tips and recommendations for how you need to enter data into the cost of production calculator. And today's webinar is a follow-up to that, basically looking at how we can use that information. After we've plugged all our information in from our business enterprises, what do we do with it, and how should we be looking at the results page? So, before we kick off, I'll just do a couple of little housekeeping things. You can connect via audio for today's webinar in a couple of different ways, either by phone or through your computer dialing in. And there's some information there on the screen in terms of dialing in, or otherwise it's on your email you would have received when you registered. If you have a question at any point for either myself or today's guest speaker, please pop that into the chat function, and that will come through to either myself as the host, or you can select who you want the question to go to. So we've got all the attendees on mute just to limit the background noise, so that's the best way to get in touch with us if you've got a question at any point in time throughout the webinar. And I might just check, if everyone, so the chat function you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, if you just wanted to enter in whereabouts you're from or the temperature today or something like that, that'd be fabulous. And I'll know that you can hear me and you've found the chat functionality on the webinar program. Awesome. Okay, great. So we're getting a few responses come through. Oh, someone's got a lovely 18 degrees. That'll be the envy of other people around the country, I'd say. Cool. Thank you very much, everyone. Glad to know you can hear me. Awesome. So very quickly, just a quick overview about who and what MLA is. Obviously, we work with the red meat industry within Australia, and we're all about providing initiatives that will contribute to the industry's sustainability, profitability, global competitiveness. We invest industry levy funds with industry's feedback into research, development, adoption, and marketing activities. In case you weren't aware, you're not automatically an MLA member if you're a levy payer. It's free to join. And you can do that on our website. And that'll mean that you can vote in things like the AGM and receive some of the different information that we send out to people as well. So that's really quite easy. So without further ado, what I'll do is introduce our guest speaker today. We're very lucky to have John Francis from Holmes Sackett down in New South Wales, who's going to run us through some of the information you can draw out of the cost of production calculator and how you can best use that in your business. John's had a lot of experience in this area, working with industry members over many years previously in this subject. So, John, without further ado, what I might do is change the settings to make you the presenter. Does that come through, John?
It doesn't appear to us, but let's try this and see where we get to. I think that might be it now.
Yep, it is. Excellent.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Terrific. Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction, Julie. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's John Francis. I'm a consultant and director of Holmes Sackett. we're a consultancy business based in Wagga in New South Wales. Julie's done a great job of familiarising you with the webinar platform, so I think I'll just get straight on to the delivery. So what I want to cover today is what cost of production is. I want to look a little about cost of production theory versus practice, because I think that's important. So this is contextualising the information before we rip into taking apart and interpreting the outcomes. Then I want to look at how you can manipulate it. That is, how can you actually change the outcome to improve your business, and what are those factors that have the most impact so that you can change something. What I'll do today, I'll go into a fair bit of detail to demonstrate the outputs of the tool. Now, the tool doesn't deliver the same level of detail that I'll deliver here. It delivers more a big picture analysis, but what I'll do is demonstrate how the inputs and outputs of the tool can actually be used by you to generate exactly what I've done here in terms of the same level of detail that I provide. The background about the tool is the development of any of these tools is a bit of a compromise between being practical and user-friendly and delivering every possible outcome to every user of the tool. If you choose the former, you lose some of the latter, and if you choose the latter, you lose some of the former. So when you're using the tool, I always like to think about thinking outside the square. So whilst the tool may deliver this output, is there another way that I can answer the question that I'm looking to answer by just taking the information that's been either put into the tool or delivered out of the tool and looking at it in another way? So I think there's a couple of important points that I really wanted to cover before I started. And the first of those is don't look at any single year's worth of data in isolation and start considering making huge changes across your business, because it could be any number of reasons that those results occurred in any one year. It's the trends over time that we're really trying to capture. So that doesn't preclude you from making changes based on 1 year of information, and particularly if you know that that's a consistent issue within your business. But I think the important point I'm making is try and go back and look historically or project forward and see what those results sort of mean to you. The second point I want to make is that as a meat producer, you need to accept that you're a commodity producer, and that means that you've got very little control over the price of your product. Sure, you may have control over some quality aspects, which may provide some price incentives, but these are generally linked to a base price, which is driven by forces largely out of your control. And commodity producers, like commodity mining products or commodity agricultural products, the best way that you can fight being a commodity producer, fight that lack of price control, is by ensuring that you've got a low cost of production. The other point I want to mention here is that what goes up usually comes down in the commodity world, and we are dealing with prices at the moment which are at all-time highs in a number of commodities, meat commodities, with the key point being here that you have to have your cost of production right so that when it does come down, you're still generating a margin for yourself. And that's really what's challenged some of those mining sector businesses, and it will challenge us if the same thing happens with our meat products. Now, I'm hoping it doesn't, but if it does and prices revert back to sort of 5-year mean levels, then being at $5.90 per kilo as a cost of production isn't going to be good enough. Okay, so what is cost of production and how do we use it? Well, cost of production is that it's expressed in dollars per kilogram of live weight when you're looking at beef, or dollars per kilogram of dress weight when you're looking at lamb or goat meat. And it really, as a measure of cost per kilogram of product, it measures the efficiency of production, and it allows you to see past just total costs, which we're always trying to minimise, or just total production, which we're always trying to maximise, so that we tend to get an optimum of each depending on the market that we're targeting. Now, it's got a reasonably strong relationship with profit, and I'll show you that shortly, and it's best manipulated through choice of production system and then through cost-effective production gains within that production system. So I'm going to talk a lot about choice of production system today. It's a particularly important part of lowering your cost of production. Now, this is less pertinent for rangeland goat producers because they're more a wild harvested situation, and the seasons will dictate to some extent the ebbs and flows of meat production. That's not the case necessarily in environments with less climatic variability and where you're actually managing the system. So cost of productions, I guess the view of cost of production is manipulated through that choice of production system, and the view that's often expressed when we're looking at chasing additional production is that relates to a degradation of the resource base. In other words, it comes with more risk. I think the point I want to make about that is that additional production doesn't necessarily have to lead to degradation of the resource base. Some of the most profitable producers also invest most heavily in fertiliser, so they generate far higher levels of pasture production, which generates those higher levels of meat production. The other point I want to make there is that opportunity cost is also a risk. So if you leave excessive biomass behind to accumulate, then effectively the opportunity cost is foregone meat production. So I think managing variation is an essential skill, and it's harder in the more marginal environments because you have greater variation. And if you think just in the less variable environments, during the last decade there was up to 10 tonnes per hectare difference in gross feed production in many locations between years. So the ability to stock up in the good years and reduce the numbers in the bad requires a pretty good understanding of feed budgeting and so on. And those things drive a low cost of production as well. Okay, so I've got three graphs up here, and we're still on the theory. I just want to talk to this for a little while. I want to talk to cost of production and enterprise profit, and we're looking at profit in terms of dollars per hectare per 100 mils. Now, what I've got here is three relationships. This data is out of the Holmes Sackett beef benchmarking data set, and I just wanted to look at the relationship between a range of indicators with profit. So if we start in, I guess the first question you ask is why use cost of production as an indicator of performance within your business? And these graphs help to some extent answer that question because cost of production has a greater influence on profits than does price or production. And so we'll use these as an example to show the differences in that relationship. So the relationship between price and profit is shown in the graph on the bottom right-hand side as you're looking at the at this slide. The relationship between price and profit's got a fair degree of variation. In this beef example, at $1.80, so the data's a bit old, at $1.80 per kilogram of price, there's a range in profit per hectare of $60 per hectare per 100 mils of rainfall. So price is important, but producers need to be aware that of the cost of production to obtain that price. The next is the relationship between production and profit. And the R-squareds, incidentally, in each of these just indicates the closer you are to the figure 1, the greater the relationship between each of those axes. So relationship between production and profit is slightly stronger than that of price and profit, which sort of makes sense. But at any given production level, there's still a range of over $40 per hectare per 100 mils. So if you take, I'm looking there at about between 30 and 40. I'm looking at a range of over $40 per hectare per 100 mils in profit, meaning you can be a 35 kilo producer, you can produce 35 kilos of beef per hectare and still generate a loss, or you can produce 35 kilos and produce a profit of $40 per hectare per 100 mils. So the next relationship, which is on the top right, now it's not perfect. This is the relationship between cost of production and profit. It's not perfect, but the level of variation that you see in profit at any one cost of production is far lower than the two preceding graphs. So the reason the relationship isn't perfect is that you can generate more profit from a slightly higher cost of production and more production, or more production than a lower cost of production and less production. So it's there are a range of ways of getting to the same point. The point I want to make there is cost of production isn't the be-all and end-all. I use it as an indicator with a suite of other financial and production indicators to identify opportunity for improvement. It is actually possible to have a very low cost of production and very low profits per hectare because you've just got very low production and a good cost structure, or a low cost structure rather. The question for those people is, should they be increasing production because the marginal benefit of that may be quite high? And it's also possible to have a higher cost of production but high levels of profit per hectare because the additional production there's enough additional production to generate a lot more profit. So cost of production is a great first step in getting familiarity with the issues and establishing how efficiently your business is operating. Once you take that step, then you can get on to the next steps, which are thinking about per hectare and per DSE performance of your business. Look, I just thought this was a useful slide in terms of targets. Now, I've put up on the left-hand side of this is a graph relating to beef production, and on the right-hand side is a graph relating to lamb production. And like all key performance indicators, it's got to be, cost of production has to be viewed in the context of finding the optimum cost of production, not the lowest cost of production, because it's possible to drive cost of production down very low, but at the same time you may lose too much production. Or there may be some price problem, and therefore you've got a business that's not more profitable. So it needs to be viewed in looking at the context of the optimum. So if these graphs are just a single year of benchmarking data for beef and lamb, and they show what an achievable target is. And in beef, that's around 90 cents to $1, and that's creeping up as prices increase, and $3 at the moment in terms of per kilo of dress weight for lamb is a very competitive lamb producer these days. Now, we don't have access to the same data for goat enterprises, but we'd love to collect it. So if you're interested in joining a group to compare your performance, then more than happy to facilitate that process and assist you. But my guess is that managed goat production businesses shouldn't be that dissimilar to lamb production businesses in terms of target levels, while rangeland systems, I think they can drive their cost of production far lower, and my guess, without really knowing, is that they should be able to produce under 2 kilos $2 per kilogram of dress weight. But there's not enough data to suggest where you are. Clearly, the lower you are, the greater the margin, but again, you can't take that lowest approach without thinking about whether you're just doing it by lowering the level of production as well. This slide's an important one because it really talks about the theory of cost of production. So I want to talk about this, and then I want to talk about the practice of cost of production, about what you see in the data, because it's really important. So the theory behind the relationship between cost of production and production is that there's going to be an optimum level of production before which cost of production falls and after which cost of production rises. So that's that bottom point in the graph. So this theoretical curve is driven by the percentage of fixed costs in the business. And as production increases, fixed costs are then reduced per unit of production because they're spread over more productive units. At some point, marginal costs of production are going to outweigh fixed costs and costs of production begin to rise again, which is where that graph kicks. And I've already made the point about the optimum not necessarily being the lowest cost of production. And the point I was making there is that it may be better to pursue a slightly lower margin because cost of production has increased with more production, and equally, it may generate more profit by pursuing a much higher margin because prices are better at lower production. So that might be where you have lighter weights in your animals or that sort of thing, and there's some sort of premium for those. In practice, within any given year, the relationship between this production and cost of production is weak, and part of the reasons for that is that there are very few real fixed costs in a farm business. Overhead costs aren't necessarily fixed. The relationship between those variable costs and production can be weak because of variation in seasonal conditions and feed supply. And input costs aren't, they can vary unrelated to the level of production. So I just want to talk about what happens in practice. So we saw that lovely curve which the theorists provided. This is actually what we get when we look at our benchmarking data, and they look nothing alike. And the reason they look nothing alike is that each one of these points is somewhere on the preceding curve. So I can't tell you, without knowing the curves that each of these people are on, exactly where they are on that curve, but everyone's curve is different, and it's determined by a range of factors. And those factors are, in some cases, unmanageable, which might be seasons and market prices, but in many cases there are a range of manageable factors that are within your control that you can actually change the shape of the curve. And we think the manageable factors are things like lambing, kidding and calving dates, turn-off dates, your systems and a range of other things. But really what you need to do is pick the system with the best curve, and that's the flattest curve at a pretty low point. So we never really see that preceding curve in a full benchmarking data set because we've got a range of curves. And over time, though, it becomes clear that some factors under the control of management actually allow producers to more consistently operate with a low cost of production and a higher level of production. And our view is that systems play a big role in that. So for you, I guess the key message, and I'll keep going on about this, is that systems are particularly important. When I'm talking systems, I'm talking time of lambing, kidding, calving, I'm talking time of turn-off, and I'm talking matching feed supply with feed demand. And they're important. I'll talk to why they're important in terms of being drivers of long-term performance as we proceed. Okay, so in the next series of slides, which relate incidentally to a prime lamb enterprise, and I've only used that for demonstration purposes. What I've done is grouped expenses into categories, and in this case it's animal health and selling costs. On each slide I'll present two graphs, and there's two columns on each graph. In each case, what I'm doing is comparing the average of the Holmes Sackett farm benchmarking results with the top 20%. And those top 20% are ranked on profit per DSE. Now, the top graph looks at costs on a per hectare basis, which is adjusted for rainfall, while the bottom graph is exactly the same information, but it's expressed as expenses per kilogram of dress weight of meat produced. All right. When you look at these graphs, I don't necessarily need you to think about exactly where you are on either of those axes. What I want you to think about is how the top graph relates to the bottom graph, and what you see in the top converts to dollars per kilogram of dress weight. Because gross cost per hectare might be higher in the top graph, but when it's expressed per kilogram of meat produced, it may actually be lower. And I want you to think, and I'll talk through why that may be. Just before I do, I just want to explain quickly why we're using dollars per hectare per 100 mils of rainfall. And the reason is this, and if I just take the animal health category from the preceding slide, what you're looking at here is two rainfall environments with very different cost structures per hectare. So the top one, we're looking at a category of animal health in a high rainfall area of 700 millimetres. The animal health cost is $27 per hectare. The cost per hectare per 100 mils is just that 27 divided by 7, which is 700 divided by 100, and that gives us $3.90. $3.90 in a low rainfall environment with 400 mils of rainfall gives us $15.60 per hectare. These figures here, that is the cost in dollars per hectare, so these figures here, those two there, are not adjusted for rainfall, so there's a high degree of variability. Whereas if I look over here, they're adjusted for rainfall and they're very similar. So what looking at dollars per hectare per 100 mils of rainfall does is allows us to pull information from different rainfall environments and provide us with a sensible outcome or a commonality, if you like. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to the preceding slide. Okay, so the first point I want to make about animal health and selling costs is that achieving lower cost of production is not all about spending less. So if you have a look at, in this case, the top producers, they spend more per hectare relative to these guys. These guys spend $8 per hectare per 100 mils. These guys spend closer to $9 per hectare per 100 mils. So the gross cost is higher for both this, which is animal health, the blue, and for this, which is selling costs of stock. Okay, now let's look at what happens on a dollar per kilo dress weight basis. Both move from being more in gross terms to a lower cost per kilo produced. Okay, so the graph demonstrates that on a per hectare per 100 mil of rainfall, the top 20% spend more on animal health and selling costs. However, per kilogram of meat produced, the expenditure is less. So that reflects the productivity of the systems, and that sometimes you actually need to spend more to get commensurately more production. So a similar or higher spend per hectare, but more production from that spend gives you a lower cost of production. So in animal health, the question is, how do you get better production from the same spend or a lower spend? And genetics is a good example. You can generate more production for the same animal health spend. If you're producing more weight per animal, but the animal health cost per animal is exactly the same. There's proactive versus reactive treatments that you can do to avoid production losses. You know, should you be treating prior to the event occurring rather than after it occurring? Because it always tends to cost more if you treat reactively rather than proactively. And are you actually using the most cost-effective product that provides you with the best solution? In terms of sale costs, how do you keep those low? Well, it is actually possible to lower sale costs by having a higher proportion of sales as direct sales, incurring no commissions. That may not suit you, but it also requires investment in a range of other areas like market knowledge and understanding and development and maintenance of buyer relationships, and looking for supply chain feedback so that you understand exactly what your market's after. There's very little control over freight because it's usually based on distance to market, and freight is tied up in this selling costs component. Having said that, there's one of the ways you can control that to some extent is having, efficient loads and that sort of thing. How many times do you send in half a load, which you get, you're paying more for those animals. But look, I think in the scheme of things, freight's probably a small one and there's not a lot of wriggle room there. Okay, so feed-based costs. What I've done is in feed-based costs, we've got supplementary feed and pasture costs. And in this case, chemical, seed, fertiliser, lime gypsum, and in supplementary feed, grain, hay and silage, agistment and grazing crops. So what happens? Well, in this case, both the pasture costs and the supplementary costs on a dollar per hectare level are actually lower relative from the top 20% relative to the average. So if you have a look here, both of these lines, the orange line here is lower than the orange line here, and the blue line here is lower than the blue line here. And once you convert that to the magnitude of the drop is even greater once we get it to a dollar per kilo of grass weight basis. So in some areas, achieving a lower cost of production can actually be about spending less. So these demonstrate that quite nicely. So you can do that through production systems that utilise pasture grown more efficiently and a lower reliability or reliance on supplementary feed because you're matching production or the seasonal production of the pasture growth curve with what's happening in your own production system from a livestock requirements perspective. Per kilogram of meat produced, this expenditure is actually less, which this demonstrates, and that just reflects the productivity of the systems that are implemented by this top 20% group here. So, sometimes you need to spend more to get commensurately more production, but not always. So mainly through lower supplements, in this case, lower feed costs per hectare, and that might be because of reduced supplementary feed, and that's where systems tend to have their biggest impact on is in the feed-based costs. So we've talked about how you get better utilisation of pasture, and that's really getting your lambing, kidding, and calving dates right. Talking about make sure your time of turn-off occurs before feed quality declines. There's no point, it's generally high cost to carry over and try and put weight onto animals where there's no feed quality that allows that weight. And then there's the other component, which is less money spent on pasture, which is largely about that out-of-season production. There's also growing more pasture, and that's increasing soil fertility or changing the pasture composition with grazing or chemical solutions, and pasture renovation is another way that you may actually grow more pasture or higher quality pasture. The other point I just wanted to make here is that some people might have high costs in this area because they've actually invested too heavily, and then the question for those people should be, well, is my soil fertility right, and should I be taking that as the low-hanging fruit? That is, should I be considering fertilising to your critical value levels of phosphorus, for example, rather than jumping in and doing a large part of improved pasture renovation program, because it could be that fertilising to critical values provides you with far greater returns on investment. So take the low-hanging fruit first and then get into those other investments, I guess, is the key point there. Okay. So moving on to labour requirements. So in this slide, this is quite a nice slide in my view. It demonstrates a few things quite nicely. There is very little difference between these two in terms of shearing and crutching costs or in terms of wages and contract services. They're nearly, dead level or close enough to it. But when you get that down to a cost per kilo of dress weight, you can see that both are lower here relative to being the same up here. So there's a range of ways that you can have similar labour cost per hectare but a lower cost per kilogram, and part of that is because the top 20% produce more. But there's a range of ways of actually thinking about how you reduce your labour costs. And the first is think about your management cost relative to operational labour cost ratio. The managers tend to be the high cost units, the operational tend to be the low cost. Is there things you can be delegating to low cost to generate more income from your own time? And that reduces your average cost of labour over everything. But the other part of it is actually about labour efficiency. And that's actually aided by systems again. If you've got a system where you don't need to supplementary feed as much, then you're going to have less labour requirements at critical times throughout your business. Simple systems, do you have lots of enterprises or do you have just one very simple enterprise? Well, that's a way of improving labour efficiency. Investment into infrastructure to improve efficiency. Are you using laneways at the moment because they may be the best use of your infrastructure spend or capital spend because it means that you free up labour to do other things, or it means that you free up labour not to be on farm. And then there's other types of ways. I talked about proactive animal health. Well, clearly that's got an influence on labour as well. If you're proactive, you get the job done, and if you think of fly control, I think is a good one. In sheep enterprises, if you act proactively, you tend not to be always chasing your tail, whereas if you reactively, it might be a few here and a few there, but that soon consumes days and days of your time. The question is, would you have been better off just doing them all up front? And there's a number of producers that just as soon as they get a few struck, well, that's it. They do the lot because they think it's more efficient. Okay, so moving on to labour-related costs. Look, labour-related costs are those costs associated with labour units. And I think the point that I want to make about labour-related costs, which is vehicle expenses, fuel and lubricants and depreciation, as soon as you've got another man, you've got another vehicle or another two vehicles. And as soon as you've got another two vehicles, you've got more expense. So the point I'm making here is think about whether you really need the next man. Can you do more with less vehicles? So less labour, really this comes back to labour efficiency again. Less labour means less vehicles, less R&M and less fuel burn. And then there's, how many vehicles are there per person in your business? Start to look at those things. Are you overcapitalised in vehicles? Would increases in production allow you to reduce some of these costs or spread them over a greater degree of production? And what level of production increase would you need to do that? Because that might be the best thing you can invest in. Administration and insurance, look, the key, the same thing seems to be coming up here. Administration and expenses include bookkeeping, accountancy, bank fees, printing, office materials, etc. The key point I want to make here is in both cases, again, you've got this higher per hectare relative to these. And once you take it to a dollar per kilo level, they're both far lower. The same thing keeps coming up with each of these, and that is you've got a similar spend per hectare or a slightly higher spend per hectare, but the cost is spread over more kilos. So hopefully the message is getting through that production per hectare is the difference between these two groups. The next slide is largely about repairs and maintenance. And the key way that you can control repairs and maintenance, in my view, you can see the top 20% have a lower repairs and maintenance spend relative to the average, and that equates to a far lower when you're looking at $1 per kilo. Look, the question is, are you spending too much time on your repairs and maintenance? Maybe what the top 20% are doing in this case is actually saying, at a point, I'm going to stop spending on that trough that's leaking and just go and buy a new one because it's costing me 3 days of my time a year or 3 days over 2 years, whatever it is. Now it's time for CapEx. So the real point I want to make here is what state is your infrastructure in? Is it adequate? And what are the real costs of inadequate infrastructure? And they really come in at this R&M level, repairs and maintenance level. Think about what you can do with that infrastructure, whether you should persist with it, the stuff that you've inherited, or whether you should start investing to improve it, because you'll see it on the bottom line through this line. There's a range of other things I haven't compared. They account for roughly 10% of the total cost of production, and there's probably very little area for improvement in a lot of these. So my take, I think the evidence is really suggesting that the key issue that differentiates the average from the top 20%, and the point that I'm making, the reason I'm bringing this point up is that it's just an easy way of demonstrating what the difference is and how you can drive a lower cost of production, is that it's all about production. This here equates to a roughly a 40% difference, I think, in production between here and here. And so really understanding what level of production you've got is absolutely critical. It's the denominator, it's the thing that drives a low cost of production. So whilst you can maintain low cost structures, and they go some of the way, don't forget about, is cutting that cost or is keeping that cost low actually doing the wrong thing because I'm actually cutting myself out of production. So generally speaking, these guys, the top 20%, they generate the additional production without significant additional costs. And they do that through increased feed utilisation, having the markets right, setting the system up, having a very proactive approach to animal health. Okay. So the numerator, look, costs, yes, it's important. If you have a look at, there's very little difference between the two cohorts on $1 per hectare per 100 mil basis. So they're achieving, the pre-feeding graph shows they're producing 40% more production, but on a per hectare basis, their costs are very similar. So the point that I think that I'm trying to demonstrate here is that try and keep your cost structures low, and as you increase production, they don't necessarily have to go up. Labour efficiency is a really important part of managing that, and cost-effective application of technology is another. So really understand whether your feed supply and feed demand curve are matching each other, because they'll play a fair role in both making sure these levels are reasonable on the top, and also making sure that these levels are being pushed over here in terms of increasing your production to a level that drops cost of production. Okay, so what's the largest influence on cost of production? Your choice of production system. it's come up for each one of those graphs. I think it's been demonstrated quite clearly in each one of those. And if you just have a look at the point I was trying to make about different production systems is this system here, the orange one, is a pathway that once you start pushing over a level of, say, 15 kilos here, you start to go up very rapidly, and people on that, with that particular system, then tend to think, well, I'm not going to pursue any more production. But it's not the production that's the issue, it's their system that's the issue. Whereas this curve, the blue curve, is a very flat curve. So regardless of whether you move from 10 here out to 20 here, you're still in a pretty good zone for any of those points from 10 to 20 kilos. So you want to have a curve that's reasonably flat. Okay, so the key messages are that cost of production is all about understanding the drivers of efficiency in your production. It does have a big impact on profits, and comparisons of individual costs within cost of production will lead to improvement in production and in cost control. Now, I just want to continue just to show you what the tool outputs are so that you can do exactly what I've done in this presentation and drill down at the individual level. So what the tool delivers is some really good information. So in this case, if you have a look at the summary of cost of production tool outputs, it doesn't get quite as detailed as I just have been, but it still provides some really good information that you can get more forensic if you like. So the first thing is that understanding that income, the bit between the expenses, so the bit between here and here, so the difference between there and there is the bit that you keep. Well, you don't keep all of it because you've got to pay a bit for taxes, and if you're financed, you might have to pay a bit for financing, but for all intents and purposes, that's the bit that you keep. So the tool is telling me that you're keeping that much. Now, the first thing I take from that is to try and establish, well, is that enough? So if you look at that for that enterprise and you say, well, that's not enough for me to pay, you know, my financing for that enterprise or the taxes on that enterprise, then clearly there's got to be some focus on increasing production from the same level of expenses or decreasing expenses for the same level of production. The next point I want to make is that this breakup here is quite useful. So we get the same effectively broken up into labour costs, direct expenses and overheads. And the really good part is that the tool gives you the total kilos of dress weight produced. So the reason I'm telling you that is that if you go to the next slide, or if we go drill into the inputs of the tool, so if you think back to last week when we were inputting all this information, you can actually look at your repairs and maintenance spend by dividing the repairs and maintenance that you put into goat production and divide that by the total number of kilos produced, and it will tell you your repairs and maintenance cost of production cost relative to production. You can do the same for any one of these items. So the point I'm making is, whilst I do that as a matter of course in my business, you may not do it as a matter of course. The course outputs of the cost of production tool are great. They're a really good starting point. They give you the margin that you've got. They give you a breakup of your expenses relative to your income, and they tell you the total kilos produced. If you want to take it to the next level, there's nothing stopping you from getting forensic by going back through the tool and establishing the cost of production of each component. Okay. Look, I think the only other point I was going to make is, and I think I made this last week, that when you look at sheep or beef costs of production, they have this little industry benchmark flag, which I think is really useful because it gives you a range and it also gives you an idea of where you are, where you sit relative to that range. We don't have that for goat meat producers only because we don't have enough data. So we're really keen to capture that data. If you're interested, please let us know because we'd love to assist in that. Look, there's a lot being covered. I think I'll hand it back to Julie and take any questions from this point.
Great. Thanks very much, John. That was I found that to be a really practical overview in terms of, you know, bringing it back to decisions you'll be making out in the field that's going to have impact. Just a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions for John, please use the chat function there and send those through. We do have a few questions, John, and your last comments were really timely, actually, because we've got one from a while ago, which was just someone inquiring as to if they were looking to get involved in some kind of goat benchmarking group, what would be involved in something like that?
Yeah, so it depends on what the what pathway you want. If you want the cost of production, if you want the cost of production as the starting point for that group, I think that's a really good starting point because it gives you an idea of all the things that we've just talked about. Effectively, what we would do is, or typically what the process is day one digs in a little more deeper than what we've done in these webinars, but we also ask you to bring your laptop along, and so we nurse you through, for want of a better term, the process with us in the room, so that when you hit a hurdle, you don't throw the towel in and say, well, it's all too hard. You've got us there to fall back on, and we can assist you in getting to where you need to be. So I think my experience with these courses is that's a really useful process because, you know, we're very familiar with the process. We understand that you're less familiar with it because you don't do this every day as part of what you do. The second part to that two-day cost of production workshop is that I go away and I analyse all the numbers. So everyone who's in that first workshop provides me 2 weeks after, or within 2 weeks of that first workshop, all the numbers, so the inputs, and then I go away and analyse those inputs, and then I put them into a range of graphs, similar to the graphs that we had there today, except that everyone in the group is a line on the graph, and there's a number associated with each person within that group, so that you're not necessarily identified within the group unless you want to be, and that's up to you. So you retain anonymity within the group, but I talk to the strengths and weaknesses of each business within that cohort. And I also compare you with where we have data, like our benchmarking data. I use that to demonstrate where you sit in terms of cost of production relative to the top 20% and the average. Now, we can do that for beef, wool, lamb and sheep meat. We can't do that for goat production systems yet because we just don't have enough data. Does that answer your question? Great, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, John. Yeah, and you sort of led into the next question, which was all around, I suppose, the difference between going through and doing something like the cost of production workshop versus a 2-day course such as Business Edge. So would you recommend, do people go through a natural progression of the cost of production workshop and then Business Edge, or what would work for people, do you think?
Yeah, thanks. That tends to be the way it progresses, so that you've got a taste for it, and like I said, there are constraints using cost of production as the only or the key performance indicator within your business. What Business Edge tends to do is use pre-existing case studies to assist your learning and skill development of business concepts. And so they are two very different things. I guess the cost of production is very focused on your own business and how you're performing. Business Edge is a skill development course that tends to provide you with a really in-depth understanding of some important business concepts and processes. There is still a step beyond Business Edge, which is implementing those processes, and that's where I guess cost of production, the starting point, is that implementation of all those processes that you've learned. So there's a range of pathways. I think these pathways will certainly become a lot clearer with profitable grazing systems, no doubt, Julie, but certainly at the moment there's still opportunity to, if people want to pursue those courses, then be in contact with either yourself or myself, and I'm more than happy to facilitate the process.
Excellent. Thanks, John. And I should just explain for our listeners, in case you aren't across some of those courses we're talking about, and it's obviously a business course that people can subscribe and join up to. And as John said, you work through some really practical examples, looking at assessing different investment options, that type of thing. And Profitable Grazing Systems is an extension and adoption program that Meat and Livestock Australia has been piloting recently, which is all around looking at producers' profit drivers across a whole variety of topics, such as the feed base within your business, looking at your supply chain, all that sort of stuff. So there's some exciting opportunities coming up soon to get involved in programs such as those. John, we had another question just in relation to, the types of data that you need to be collecting and what if people aren't really collecting very much at the present time in terms of things like their stocking rates, if they're in an extensive environment, for example, somewhere up north perhaps, where they've got a lot. What sort of level of data collection do you really need to get stuck into this stuff?
Yeah, so the beauty of cost of production is that you actually don't need stocking rate, because we don't look at per hectare production and we don't look at per DSE production. We only look at your total production. So that's part of the beauty of it. You don't need to get too tied up. To get to the next level though, so if you had a high cost of production, one of the next steps would be establishing whether it's an issue with the level of production that you've got, and one way of doing that is to understand whether your stocking rate is at optimum levels and whether your feed utilisation, or more importantly, that you are utilising feed really efficiently. And the second part of that is, your costs are on a gross basis. So again, this cost of production is really tailored to not digging into the detail. It's tailored to being a gross measure. So, but the next step is then taking it to stocking rate areas, that sort of thing, which can be done. It tends to be done as an extension of the cost of production course. So if you've got your production, the next step is, well, how many hectares are you running? What's your effective grazing area? Now we can tell you your production per hectare. What's the number of DSEs? Now we can tell you your production per DSE, and that sort of thing. So we can get into a lot more detail. But as a first step, I think keeping out of that level of detail is really important, because you don't want to get tied up in too much detail, and the idea is to keep it simple, so that we don't turn people away from it. But another point I just want to make on record keeping, that so thanks for the question to the person that brought it up, is having your chart of accounts separated by enterprise is particularly important. And what I mean by that is not just lumping everything into animal health. So if you've got a drench, just chucking it into animal health. It should be animal health for goats, animal health for lambs, animal health for beef. And then if you got that drench, did that drench go to the beef enterprise, the lamb enterprise or the goat enterprise, and then allocating it as such. That's really important because the more detail you've got on your chart of accounts, the more likely you are to actually want to undertake the process that we've just outlined in the last few days.
Cool. Thanks very much, John. Look, if anyone else has any further questions at all, please do pop those into the chat function, and we can take advantage of John's expertise while we've got him. Whilst you're thinking about any further questions you might have, if you want any further information, this webinar is of course being recorded, and following the webinar I'll be sending out an email to everyone just with a link to where that's going to be uploaded to the MLA website for you to watch later. Link there on your screen to go to the cost production calculator if you want to go and have a play, which would be excellent. And there's a whole range of information there in terms of previous webinars and other information which might be of use or interest to you depending on your enterprise mix and where you're at. And there's some additional information there as well. I'll circulate a copy of this for people so you've got that. And we do have some other upcoming events which relate directly to the topic of this webinar. So there's a range of Business Edge courses that we've got advertised on the MLA website that you can register for. There'll certainly be more running throughout the year and in different states and locations, so don't worry there at all. And if you did want a course run in your local area, please do get in touch with us and we can help you get that arranged and with the local Business Edge service provider. If you get a group together or something in your area, we're very happy to do that. So John, I think you're actually off the hook. We haven't had any further questions come through. So just wanted to thank you very much for your time and expertise today in answering those questions and giving us that really comprehensive overview. And thank you very much to all our audience members for dialing in and giving us your time today and listening in. Don't forget, if you've got any further questions about anything, just let us know. And if you've got any suggestions of what you'd like to see happen in future webinars, topics, that kind of thing, please also let us know. Happy to have some suggestions there. So I think that's it, John. Thank you very much for your time, and we might wrap it up there.
Thanks for the opportunity. Bye now.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone else. Bye.